The blue light of my triple monitor setup was the only thing illuminating my apartment at 2:14 a.m. For a freelance software engineer like me, this wasn't late, it was prime time. The world was quiet, the distractions were minimal, and the bandwidth was usually wide open. I was in the middle of a high-stakes deployment for a fintech client in London, pushing several gigabytes of encrypted code to a production server. Then, it happened. The dreaded spinning wheel of death. My terminal window froze. The progress bar, which had been sliding along at a crisp 400 mbps, stalled at 74%. I clicked refresh on my browser. Loading. Loading. The little gray circle spun with mocking indifference. "Come on, you piece of junk," I muttered, slamming my palm against the desk. "I pay for the ultimate tier fiber optic package. I'm talking low latency, symmetrical upload/download speeds that could power a small village. Lag shouldn't exist in my world." I opened a command prompt and ran a standard ping test. Ping statistics for 8.8.8.8, packets, sent equals 4, received equals 4, lost equals 0, 0% loss, minimum equals 450 milliseconds, maximum equals 1200 milliseconds. 450 milliseconds. That's not a connection, that's a carrier pigeon. My latency was through the roof. Something was hogging my pipe, something massive. Most people would just power cycle their router and go to bed. But I'm a coder, I'm obsessive by nature. I opened a browser and logged into my router's gateway, the brain of my home network. I navigated to the DHCP client list, a digital roll call of every device currently drawing life from my Wi-Fi. I expected to see the usual suspects: my workstation, my laptop, my iPhone, my smart fridge, and maybe my Kindle. There were 6 devices. The 6th one didn't have a name like Leo's iPad or Sonos system. It was a string of hexadecimal code that resolved into a host name, 01 basement server. My heart skipped a beat, though at the time, it was mostly out of annoyance. I live on the 4th floor of an old, refurbished textile mill. The building is a labyrinth of brick and exposed piping. I didn't have a basement. In fact, the only person with access to the building's sublevel was the resident caretaker and my neighbor directly below me in 4B, Mr. Eris. Mr. Eris was a man who seemed to have been carved out of dry wood. He was thin, gray, and always smelled faintly of mothballs and damp earth. He never spoke to anyone, and on the rare occasions I saw him in the hallway, he would stare at my shoes until I passed. He was the last person I'd expect to be a server-owning tech enthusiast. "You cheap old bastard," I whispered to the empty room. He must have used a Wi-Fi cracker or simply guessed my password during one of our brief, awkward hallway encounters where I was probably distracted. I was about to hit the block MAC address button and be done with it. I'd change my SSID to something like ICU Eris just to let him know I wasn't an easy mark. But then, I noticed the data throughput. 01 basement server wasn't just browsing the web. It was pulling down 80% of my total bandwidth. It was currently sustaining a massive, encrypted tunnel. The smart move was to cut him off. The me that wanted to get back to work insisted on it. But a darker, more curious part of my brain, the part that loves debugging complex puzzles, prevailed. I wanted to see what a reclusive, 70-year-old man was doing with a basement server on a hijacked connection at 2 in the morning. I fired up a packet sniffer, a tool called Wireshark. It allows you to intercept and log the traffic passing through a network. Since he was on my router, I was the king of this digital castle. Every bit and byte he sent or received was mine to inspect. I set the filter to isolate the IP address of the basement server and began the capture. At first, the screen was a blur of scrolling text, standard TCP handshakes and encrypted TLS headers. But I noticed a pattern. The server was making repeated requests to an onion-rooted gateway. He was using the Tor network, the deep web. "Okay, Eris. What are you hiding? I ran a script to bypass the basic encryption layers of his local cache. It's a trick I learned back in my white hat hacking days. Within minutes, the scrambled data began to resolve into readable strings. It wasn't Netflix. It wasn't a bank. It was a directory of local files and a series of search queries being fed into a private, unindexed engine. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my glasses. My annoyance was replaced by a cold, prickling sensation at the base of my neck. The logs showed a list of search queries sent over the last hour. They weren't the searches of a man looking for cheap prescriptions or gardening tips. Timestamp 1 hour 42 minutes and 1 second, query, structural blueprints 1922 mill building, ventilation shafts. Timestamp 1 hour 48 minutes and 15 seconds, query, lidocaine HCl powder bulk solubility in water. Timestamp 1 hour 55 minutes and 30 seconds, query, human eye reaction to high-intensity strobe at 15 Hz. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. The 1922 mill building was this building. I stared at the query about lidocaine. I knew what that was, a local anesthetic. Why would he need to know how to dissolve it in water? Then came the directory access. The basement server was pulling files from a local drive. I managed to mirror the file names as they were being accessed. FLR_4_hallway_cam_ext.mp4. Unit_4a_entry_log.txt, 4a, that was my apartment. Subject_Leo_sleep_cycle_week3.xlsx. My breath hitched. My name. He had a spreadsheet of my sleep cycle. I looked around my darkened living room. The shadows suddenly seemed longer, more predatory. The hum of my computer, which usually comforted me, now felt like a blaring alarm. I wasn't just being robbed of my internet, I was being studied. I looked back at the screen, my fingers trembling as I scrolled down to the most recent activity. Mr. Aris or whoever was using that server had just opened a new browser tab. The query was being typed in real time. I watched the letters appear on my monitor as he typed them on his. Is 400 milligrams of lidocaine enough to keep a 180 pounds male conscious but unable to move? I weigh exactly 180 pounds. I sat there, frozen in my ergonomic chair, the spinning wheel of death finally disappearing as the page loaded. But the connection wasn't fixed. It was worse. He was done downloading. He was ready to start. A soft, metallic clink echoed from the kitchen. It sounded like the heavy iron cover of the floor-level ventilation grate being slowly, carefully set aside. The sound of the metallic clink from the kitchen seemed to reverberate through the thin walls of my apartment like a gunshot. I sat perfectly still, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard, afraid that even the slightest click of a key would broadcast my awareness to the predator lurking in the dark. For a long minute, there was only the low, steady hum of my PC's cooling fans and the thumping of my heart against my ribs. I stared at the ventilation grate in the corner of the kitchen, visible through the open doorway. It was a heavy, cast iron piece of industrial history, typical of these converted mills. It was supposed to be screwed shut. I didn't go to the kitchen. I couldn't. My legs felt like they had been replaced by lead pipes. Instead, I turned my attention back to the screen, my only window into the mind of the monster. If 01 basement server was typing queries about my weight and my sleep cycle, it meant the data was being processed somewhere. I needed to know the where and the how. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was a debugger, and this was the most critical bug of my life. I opened a secondary terminal and initiated a man-in-the-middle, MITM, attack on the intruder's connection. Since the server was using my router as its gateway, I could force it to route all its unencrypted traffic through a local proxy I controlled. I began poisoning the ARP cache, tricking the basement server into thinking my laptop was the router. Suddenly, the data stream turned from a trickle into a flood. The server wasn't just searching, it was archiving. My screen filled with a directory tree that made my stomach churn. The folder names were dates, 6 months of dates. I clicked on the most recent one, March_29_logs. Inside were hundreds of small files. I opened one titled mic_feed_living_room.wave. I plugged in my noise-canceling headphones, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped them. I hit play. The audio was grainy, but the content was unmistakable. It was the sound of me, 5 minutes ago, muttering "you cheap old bastard" to myself. Then, the sound of my keyboard clicking. But there was a second sound in the background, a wet, rhythmic breathing that didn't belong to me. It was closer to the microphone than I was. The microphone wasn't in my laptop. It wasn't in my phone. The audio quality suggested it was hidden inside something hollow. Something like the ventilation shaft. I closed the audio file, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to see more. I navigated to a folder labeled vid_ext_streams. It wasn't just my apartment. The server was connected to a network of hijacked Nest and Ring cameras throughout the building. I saw Mrs. Gable from 3C folding laundry. I saw the hallway on the second floor. But the primary focus was always 4A, my unit. There were trigger logs. Motion detected, bedroom, 11:42 p.m. Motion detected, bathroom, 7:15 a.m. Object identified, pharmaceutical, lidocaine. The last log sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. I hadn't bought lidocaine. I didn't even have any in my medicine cabinet. I looked back at the search query on the other monitor: is 400 milligrams of lidocaine enough? If he wasn't buying it, and I didn't have it, it meant he already possessed it. He was calculating the dosage for the supply he had sitting right next to him. I went deeper into the server's media partition. I found a hidden directory titled project_rebirth. It was password protected. Normally, a 256-bit encryption would take years to crack, but I noticed a text file sitting in the root directory named notes.txt. I opened it. It was a list of passwords, but they weren't random strings of characters. They were personal. Leo_mother_maiden_1965. Leo_first_dog_buster. Leo_high school_blue devils. He knew everything. He hadn't just cracked my Wi-Fi, he had spent months harvesting my digital soul. He had read my old emails, looked through my backed up photos, and mapped out my entire life history to guess my security patterns. The password for project_rebirth was my own social security number. I typed it in, my skin crawling with the violation of it all. The folder opened. It was a gallery of post-op photos. My vision blurred as I looked at them. They weren't of me, not yet. They were photos of young men who looked remarkably like me. Same build, same hair color, same glasses. But in the photos, they were altered. They were sitting in a basement, the basement surrounded by old machinery and brick walls. Their eyes were wide, glassy, and fixed on the camera. They were dressed in clothes I recognized. A vintage flannel shirt I'd lost a year ago. A pair of sneakers that had gone missing from my doorstep. They weren't dead. They were conscious but unable to move. They were dolls. Living, breathing dolls made in my image. I couldn't just sit here. I had to call the police. I reached for my phone, but then I remembered the log, Leo's phone, connected. If I tried to dial 911, he would see it instantly. He would know I had crossed the line from clueless neighbor to threat. I had to be smarter. I had to use the one advantage I had: I was better at this than he was. He was a predator, but I was the architect of the network. I began writing a script in Python, my fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, desperate precision. I called it blackout.py. The goal was simple: overload the basement server's CPU by flooding it with recursive data loops, while simultaneously triggering an authentication attack that would kick every device except mine off the Wi-Fi. If I could crash his system, I might buy enough time to run to the door. As the script compiled, I watched the packet sniffer one last time. A new file was being uploaded from the basement server to a cloud drive. The file name was final_phase_initiated.pdf. I intercepted the transfer and forced a local preview. It was a floor plan of my apartment, but it had been modified. Red lines showed a path through the wall behind my desk, the very wall I was leaning against. The notes on the PDF read: subject is distracted by the network traffic. Visual confirmed via ceiling vent. Use the service panel behind the drywall. Administer 400 mg via neck muscle. Secure the doll before the power cycles. My heart stopped. He wasn't in the kitchen. The noise in the vent had been a distraction, a ping to see if I would move. He was behind me. Right now. Slowly, without moving my head, I looked at the dark reflection of the room in my glossy monitor. The wall behind me was covered in a heavy, decorative tapestry I'd hung to dampen the sound for my recording sessions. I saw a slight, rhythmic bulge behind the fabric. The drywall was being cut from the other side, silent and slow, muffled by the thick wool of the tapestry. I looked back at my screen. The blackout.py script was at 98%. The intruder's terminal suddenly popped up a message. He wasn't using the search engine anymore. He had opened a direct chat window with my IP address. 01 basement server, you're very good, Leo. I haven't had a subject try to MITM me before. I didn't reply. I just stared at the progress bar. 99%. 01 basement server, but you made one mistake. You're looking at the data stream. You should have been looking at the power draw. Suddenly, the UPS, uninterruptible power supply, under my desk began to beep. Low voltage. Low voltage. He hadn't just cut my internet. He had bridged the electrical circuit of my apartment into his server. He wasn't stealing my bandwidth, he was using my apartment as a giant battery to power his basement. The tapestry behind me shifted. A handpail, thin and smelling of damp earth, reached out from the gap in the wall. It held a gleaming, stainless steel syringe filled with a clear, viscous liquid. The blackout.py script hit 100%. I slammed the enter key. Every light in the apartment and the monitors themselves died instantly. The silence was absolute. The only thing I could hear was the rasping breath of Mr. Eris, now inches from my ear, and the soft, terrifying hiss of the syringe being primed in the dark. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight. In the high-ceilinged industrial skeleton of the old mill, the sudden death of my 3 monitors felt like being plunged into deep water. My eyes, scorched by hours of blue light and scrolling code, screamed in the void. For a heartbeat, the only thing I could see were the ghostly, purple afterimages of the lines of code I'd just been reading. Final_phase_initiated burned into my retinas like a curse. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I knew that the moment I shifted, the friction of my clothes against the ergonomic mesh of my chair would be a beacon to the man standing 3 feet behind me. The scent of him arrived before the sound. It was the smell of ancient dust, wet concrete, and that cloying, medicinal sharp hit of mothballs. It was the smell of a basement that hadn't seen the sun in a century. Clink. The sound of the syringe hitting the metal frame of my desk. He had missed. In the split second between the power dying and the total silence, I had instinctively slumped forward. Leo, the voice rasped. It wasn't the voice of a frail old neighbor. It was dry, like sandpaper over bone. You shouldn't have turned off the lights. It's much harder to see the beauty of the transition in the dark. I didn't answer. I rolled. I didn't stand up, I knew the layout of my office too well to risk being a standing target. I dropped to the floor, my knees hitting a tangle of Cat6 cables and power bricks. I crawled toward the kitchen, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. Every inch of movement felt like a gamble. My apartment, usually my sanctuary of high-tech comfort, had become a minefield of smart furniture and expensive obstacles. I reached the doorway to the kitchen. My hands found the cold, hard edge of the island counter. I knew that if I could get to the drawer near the stove, I had a heavy chef's knife. But more importantly, I had a tactical flashlight, one of those 1000 lumen blasters I'd bought for emergencies. A soft, rhythmic scraping came from the office. Scrape. Step. Scrape. He was dragging something. Or maybe he was just feeling his way along the wall. I watched you for 3 months, Leo, Eris whispered. The voice was closer now. He was in the hallway. I watched you write code. I watched you eat your cold noodles at 3 a.m. I even watched you cry when that girl from 2B didn't text you back. You were so accessible. Like an open port. I reached the drawer. I pulled it slowly, praying the glides wouldn't squeak. Success. My fingers brushed against the cold steel of the knife, but I went for the flashlight first. I gripped the knurled aluminum body, my thumb hovering over the tail cap switch. I didn't turn it on yet. That would be a suicide note. I needed to know exactly where he was. You're wondering about the others, aren't you? Eris continued. I could hear him bumping into the edge of my dining table. The dolls in the folder. They were all like you. Efficient. Logical. People who thought they understood the world because they could see the data. But they missed the physical reality. They missed the spaces between the walls. The spaces between the walls. I remembered the floor plan I'd intercepted. The red lines. The mill wasn't just converted into apartments, it was a hollow shell. The thick brick exterior hid a labyrinth of maintenance shafts, old steam pipes, and ventilation voids that the developers had simply covered with drywall to save money. Eris hadn't been living in 4B. He had been living in the building itself. 4B was just his front end. I'm right here, Leo, Eris said. The voice was directly across the kitchen island. I could smell the lidocaine, now a chemical, bitter scent. I didn't hesitate. I jammed my thumb down on the flashlight's button, clicking it into strobe mode. The kitchen exploded into a chaotic nightmare of white light. 10 Hz pulses, the exact frequency he had been searching for in his logs. High-intensity strobe flashes are designed to disorient the human brain, creating a stop-motion effect that destroys depth perception and causes temporary flash blindness. In the strobe light, I finally saw him. He wasn't the hunched old man from the hallway. He was standing tall, his skin a sickly, translucent gray, stretched tight over a frame that looked like it was made of wire. He was wearing a grease-stained jumpsuit with dozens of custom pockets. In his right hand was the syringe. In his left, a pair of heavy-duty industrial shears. His eyes were the worst part. They were wide, unblinking, and fitted with some kind of primitive, DIY night vision goggles, red lenses held on by elastic bands. The strobe light hit them, and he screamed, a sound like a dying animal, as the 1000 lumens burned straight into his dilated pupils. He lunged blindly over the counter. I swung the heavy mallite like a club. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening thunk. He tumbled over the island, crashing into my collection of glass jars. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I turned and bolted for the front door. My apartment has a high-security smart lock. It requires a fingerprint or a code. I reached out, my thumb trembling, and pressed it against the scanner. Beep boop. A red light flashed. Access denied. I tried again. Access denied. No, no, no. I hissed. I realized with a jolt of horror that Blackout.py hadn't just crashed his server, It had triggered a fail-secure state in my own home automation. Because the lock was tied to the Wi-Fi network, the network he had hijacked, it was now locked in admin mode. And I wasn't the admin anymore. I was trapped in my own fortress. The strobe light was still bouncing around the kitchen, but I could hear Eris scrambling to his feet. He was laughing a wet, hacking sound. "You're a genius, Leo. You really are. You locked us both in." I looked around the living room, desperate. The windows were reinforced plexiglass, standard for the industrial loft aesthetic, and impossible to break without a sledgehammer. The only other way out was. I looked at the tapestry in my office. The bulge was still there. The drywall had been cut. If I couldn't go out through the front, I had to go into the walls. I had to enter his world. I ran back into the office, the strobe light from the kitchen casting long, jerky shadows. I grabbed my laptop. The battery was at 12%, but I needed the data and shoved it into my backpack. I grabbed the chef's knife from the floor where I'd dropped it and dove toward the tapestry. I ripped the fabric down. Behind it was a jagged, rectangular hole, about 3 feet high. It didn't lead to another apartment. It led into a dark, vertical shaft filled with humming wires and the smell of ozone. I crawled inside just as Eris rounded the corner of the office. "That's it, Leo," he shrieked, his voice distorted by rage and pain. "Go to the basement. Go home." The space behind the walls was a nightmare of 19th century brick and 21st century fiber optics. I was on a narrow wooden catwalk that seemed to service the building's main electrical spine. I turned off the strobe light and switched to a low-power beam. I looked down. The shaft descended into a bottomless pit of shadows. But every few feet, there were small platforms built out of scavenged plywood. On these platforms were the components of his network. Routers, cooling fans, and stacks of hard drives, all glowing with an eerie, rhythmic green light. It was a literal ghost in the machine. He had built a parasitic civilization inside the walls of the mill, feeding off the tenants' power and their data. I began to climb down the service ladder, my boots ringing softly on the cold iron. I needed to find the 01 basement server. If I could find the physical machine, I could find the override codes for the front door. Or better yet, I could find a way out through the actual basement. But as I descended, I realized the search results I'd seen earlier weren't just about me. I passed a platform at the 3rd floor level. There, pinned to the brickwork with surgical staples, were hundreds of Polaroids. They were arranged in a perfect, terrifying grid. It wasn't just dolls. It was a map of the building's inhabitants, color-coded by utility. The providers, people with high-speed internet. My picture was at the top. The donors, people with blood types that matched his needs. The parts, people whose physical attributes he admired. Under my photo, in neat, handwritten script, he had written, "The brain. Replacement found." I realized then that Eris wasn't just making dolls. He was failing. His own body was gray and wire-thin because it was dying. He wasn't looking for a hobby, he was looking for a host. He wanted to upload his life into my world, and my body was the final piece of hardware he needed. A vibration shook the ladder. I looked up. Eris wasn't following me down the ladder. He was cutting the cables. "If I can't have the brain intact," he yelled from the darkness above, "I'll settle for the scrap." The first steel cable snapped with a sound like a whip. The catwalk beneath my feet groaned and tilted dangerously toward the abyss. The second steel cable didn't snap, it unspooled with a screeching groan of tortured metal that vibrated through the solace of my boots. I lunged for the rusted iron rungs of the maintenance ladder bolted to the brickwork just as the catwalk vanished beneath me. The sound of the wooden platform crashing into the abyss below was a sickening, distant thud, a reminder of exactly how far I had to fall. I hung there, suspended in the vertical throat of the building, my backpack pulling at my shoulders. Above me, The strobe light from my kitchen was a dying flicker, a strobe pulse heartbeat that illuminated Eris's face every half second. He looked down at me, his red-lensed goggles glowing like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. "You were always so focused on the cloud, Leo," he shouted, his voice echoing off the damp bricks. "You forgot that everything eventually comes down to the dirt." He began to climb down after me. He didn't use the ladder, he moved like an insect, hands and feet finding grips in the gaps between the bricks and the thick clusters of hijacked fiber optic cables that lined the shaft like black vines. I scrambled down the rungs, my hands slick with grease and cold sweat. I wasn't just climbing, I was falling with intent. Every 10 feet, I passed another node scavenged routers and humming hard drives strapped to the walls with duct tape and zip ties. The heat coming off them was intense, a dry, electric fever that made the air shimmer. I reached the bottom of the shaft. It wasn't the concrete floor of a basement. It was a false floor made of server racks laid on their sides, forming a metallic, glowing grid. I dropped onto the surface, the fans of 100 cooling units whirring beneath my feet like a swarm of angry hornets. I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through a fog of dust and ozone. This wasn't a server room. It was an ossuary. Stacks of old hardware Pentium towers, discarded Mac Pros, industrial switches were piled like rib cages against the walls. And woven between them, held in place by thick bundles of Ethernet cables, were the dolls. I stumbled back, my light washing over the first one. It was a man, perhaps in his late 20s. He was seated in a modified dental chair, his head encased in a VR headset that had been gutted and rewired. Tubes ran from a series of 4 bags labeled lidocaine/saline into his arms. His skin was the color of parchment, and his muscles had withered to nothing. But his fingers were moving. They were taped to a high-speed capacitive touchpad. Even in his drug-induced paralysis, his subconscious was being harvested. He was a human processor, his brain being used to solve complex cryptographic strings that a silicon chip couldn't handle as efficiently. "Oh God," I whispered. I looked further into the room. There were 4 of them. Each one was a subject I had seen in the folder. They weren't just trophies, they were the 01 basement server. The server wasn't a machine. It was a hive mind of kidnapped coders and engineers, their collective intelligence bridged by Eris's parasitic network. And there, in the center of the room, was an empty chair. A sleek, ergonomic chair that looked exactly like the one in my office. Above it hung a sign, handwritten on a piece of cardboard, reserved, "The Brain." I heard a heavy thud behind me. Eris had landed. He stood between me and the only exit, a heavy steel door that likely led to the building's sub-basement utility tunnels. "Do you see it now, Leo?" Eris asked, stepping into the light. He had removed his goggles. His eyes were milky with cataracts, yet he seemed to see me perfectly through the network. "Silicon is limited. It decays. It bottlenecks. But the human mind, when properly dampened, it is the perfect architecture. You're the best I've ever found. Your blackout script? Beautiful. It took the others years to learn that kind of aggressive recursion. You did it in minutes." He took a step forward, the industrial shears clicking in his hand. "I don't want to kill you. I want to optimize you." I backed away, my heel catching on a thick power trunk. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. 12% battery. No, 8%. The cold air of the basement was draining the lithium-ion cells fast. I flipped it open. The screen glowed, a brilliant white rectangle in the gloom. I didn't have a Wi-Fi signal down here, Eris's jammer was too strong. But I did have a physical connection. I saw a loose Cat6 cable hanging from the central hub, the master node that bridged the 4 paralyzed men to the outside world. If I could plug in, I could bypass Eris's wireless encryption entirely. I could speak directly to the building's hardware. "Stay back!" I yelled, brandishing the chef's knife in one hand while I fumbled for the Ethernet port with the other. Eris laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You're going to hack me? While I'm standing right here. You're a software boy, Leo. You don't have the stomach for the hardware." He lunged. I ducked under the swing of the shears, the metal blades whistling past my ear. I slammed the Ethernet cable into my laptop. Link established, 10 Gbps. The laptop screen turned into a blur of scrolling data. Because I was physically plugged into his brain, I wasn't fighting a firewall anymore. I was inside his nervous system. I didn't try to unlock the doors. I didn't try to call for help. I knew he would kill me before the first packet reached the ISP. I did something much worse. I opened the directory for the lidocaine distribution subsystem. "What are you doing?" Eris hissed, his face contorting as he realized I wasn't typing a distress signal. "You said I was the brain, Eris." I gritted my teeth, my fingers flying across the keys, bypassing the safety protocols. "So I'm taking control of the body." I executed a command to invert flow. In the corner of the room, the 4 pumps connected to the 4 dolls began to beep frantically. Instead of a slow, steady drip of anesthetic to keep them paralyzed, the pumps began to draw the fluid back into the bags, replacing it with a concentrated burst of adrenaline and caffeine, the emergency wake-up protocol Eris used when he needed more processing power. "No!" Eris screamed. He didn't come for me. He ran toward the chairs. He knew what was coming. The dolls weren't just machines, they were people who had been trapped in a living nightmare for months, maybe years. And they were waking up. The man in the first chair let out a long, ragged groan. His fingers, previously moving in a rhythmic, coded dance, suddenly clenched into fists. His eyes snapped open behind the VR headset. My laptop screen flickered. 3% battery. I had seconds left. I navigated to the building management system, BMS. I found the command for the front door of my apartment, the service elevators, and the main gate. Override admin, Leo_01. Command, all_locks_open. A series of heavy, metallic clunks echoed through the building above us. The smart prison I had lived in was finally open. I looked up from the screen. Eris was struggling with the first doll, trying to shove a needle into the man's neck to put him back under. But the man, driven by a primal, adrenaline-fueled rage, had grabbed Eris by the throat. The other 3 were twitching, their muffled screams beginning to fill the room as their minds returned to their withered bodies. "Leo! Help me!" Eris choked out, his eyes bulging as the subject he had tortured for months began to squeeze. "The network, it will collapse. All that data, gone." I stood up, closing the laptop. The screen went black just as the battery died. I looked at the steel door. It was unlocked now. I looked back at the digital ossuary, at the flickering lights and the 5 men, the predator and his victims, locked in a desperate, silent struggle in the dark. I had the override codes. I had the evidence on my hard drive. I could run. But then I saw the terminal on the master node. A new message was printing out, sent from an external source someone Eris had been selling our data to. Client_X, the shipment is at the docks. Why is the brain offline? If the data isn't verified in 5 minutes, we initiate the clean sweep protocol. I froze. Clean sweep. I looked at the ceiling. Hidden between the server racks and the brickwork were small, red canisters I hadn't noticed before. They weren't fire extinguishers. They were labeled, thermite charge, emergency disposal. Eris wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a middleman. And his employers didn't leave witnesses. The red lights on the thermite canisters didn't just blink, they pulsed with a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my teeth. In the world of high-stakes data security, a clean sweep wasn't a metaphor, it was a scorched earth policy. Thermite burns at over 2200 degrees Celsius 4000 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't just destroy hard drives, it liquefies the steel racks they sit on. It turns a skyscraper into a vertical furnace in minutes. I looked at the four men, the dolls, who were now thrashing in their chairs. The adrenaline I'd pumped into their systems was doing its job, but their muscles were atrophied from months of misuse. They were like newborn fawns trying to stand on a frozen lake. "We have to move. Now!" I screamed, the sound tearing at my throat. Eris was still pinned against a server rack, the man I'd identified as Subject 1 holding him by the throat with a skeletal hand. Eris's face was turning a bruised shade of purple, his eyes bulging as he stared at the red canisters. He knew exactly what they were. He was a disposable tool, and his masters were about to toss him into the fire. I ran to Subject 1 and grabbed his shoulder. "Let him go. If we don't leave in the next 3 minutes, we're all ash." The man turned his head toward me. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils blown wide from the adrenaline. He didn't speak, he just let out a guttural, wet sound and shoved Eris aside. Eris slumped to the floor, gasping for air, his dignity as a predator stripped away by the very hardware he had tried to master. I didn't waste another second on him. I went to the second chair, a woman whose records I'd seen earlier. Her name was Sarah, a systems architect who had vanished from her apartment in the West End 6 months ago. I ripped the VR headset from her face. "Sarah, look at me," I said, my voice urgent. "I'm Leo. I'm a coder. I've opened the service doors. Can you walk?" She looked at me, her gaze flickering between terror and a strange, distant recognition. The packets," she whispered. "The stream it's broken. The stream is dead, Sarah. We're going home." I helped her up, her weight nearly dragging me down. I gestured to the other two men, who were now fumbling with their restraints. We were a pathetic sight, 5 ghosts in a digital graveyard, trying to outrun a chemical fire. The terminal on the master node chirped. "Client_X, T-120 seconds. Clean sweep initiated. Goodbye, Eris." The first canister, the one nearest the ceiling, hissed. A plume of white smoke began to curl out of it. That was the primer. Once it ignited, the thermite would drop like molten rain. "I need to stop the detonation," I muttered. My laptop was dead, but the master node was still powered by the building's main trunk. I shoved Eris away from the console and began typing directly into the bare metal interface. It was a Linux-based kernel, but the commands were obfuscated. It was a language I recognized from the deep web logs, Malbolge, one of the most difficult programming languages ever conceived. It was designed to be unreadable, even to the person who wrote it. I can't find the interrupt," I shouted. My fingers were shaking. The syntax was a nightmare of random characters and inverted logic. "Offset 0x4f, a raspy voice said behind me. It was Subject 1. He was leaning against a server rack, his breathing heavy. His eyes were fixed on the screen. "The loop is at the 4th hex block," he wheezed. "Eris used a X or cipher on the trigger." He wasn't just a victim, he was the one who had written the code Eris had stolen. He knew the backdoors because they were his own. I followed his lead. 0x4fx or 0xff. The screen flashed green. Detonation_suspended, 60 seconds. "It's only a delay," I yelled. "The client will just retransmit the trigger. We have to go." We stumbled toward the steel door. I grabbed my backpack and the heavy malite. Eris was still on the floor, crawling toward a hidden floor safe. He was still trying to save his data, his life's work, even as the air began to smell of ozone and burning metal. "Leave it, Eris," I shouted, but I didn't stop to help him. We burst through the steel door into the utility tunnels. These were the veins of the city, cold, damp, and smelling of salt and sewage. I led the 4 dolls through the darkness, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Behind us, a dull, muffled whoosh echoed through the tunnel. The 60 seconds were up. A wave of intense heat blasted through the door we had just exited. The thermite had ignited. I didn't look back, but I knew the digital ossuary was gone. The servers, the data, the photos of my life, and likely Mr. Eris himself, were being reduced to a puddle of molten slag. The building above us would survive. Thermite is targeted and surgical, but everything inside those hidden walls was being erased from existence. We emerged from a heavy manhole cover in an alleyway 3 blocks away from the mill building. The cool night air hit us like a benediction. I helped Sarah out first, then the others. We stood there, a group of emaciated, shivering figures in the middle of a city that had no idea we existed. In the distance, I could see the mill building. There was no smoke, no flames. The clean sweep was perfect. To the outside world, nothing had happened. My apartment would simply be vacant or under renovation. Sarah sat on a stack of pallets, her eyes fixed on the stars. "Is it real?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's real," I said, sitting down next to her. I reached into my bag and pulled out the one thing I had saved, the external hard drive I had used to mirror the basement server's logs before the power died. I had the names. I had the IP addresses of Client X. I had the evidence of the dolls. The nightmare was over, but the war was just beginning. Eris was a symptom. The client was the disease. They were the ones who bought the brains, the ones who turned people into hardware. 1 month later. I live in a small cabin in the woods of upstate New York. There is no Wi-Fi. There is no smart anything. I use an old, manual typewriter for my notes, and my only connection to the outside world is a satellite phone I keep in a Faraday bag. The police had found the basement, of course. Or rather, they found a room filled with melted metal and the charred remains of a man who couldn't be identified. The dolls were in a private recovery facility, their identities kept secret for their own safety. They were learning how to be human again. I opened my backpack and pulled out the hard drive. I'd spent weeks analyzing the data I'd managed to save. Most of it was corrupted by the fire, but one file remained intact. It was a hidden outgoing transmission sent just seconds before I hit the suspend command. It wasn't sent to Client X. It was sent to me. I plugged the drive into an air-gapped, battery-powered laptop. I opened the file. It was a video. The camera was low, positioned inside my own bedroom vent. It was a recording of me, sleeping, from 3 nights ago. But the timestamp was wrong. The timestamp said the video was recorded last night. I looked up at the ceiling of my cabin. There was a small, circular vent near the corner. A familiar, high-pitched hum began to emanate from my satellite phone. A message appeared on the screen, bypassing the Faraday bag, bypassing the encryption, bypassing the very laws of the network I thought I understood. 01 basement server, did you really think I was only in the building, Leo? I'm in the signal. And the signal is everywhere. I looked at the routerless, wireless room. I realized then that Eris was right. I was a software boy. And I had forgotten the most important rule of the digital age. Once you're on the network, you never truly go offline.